This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Tonight, Kathryn, Robert, and I are talking about climaxes, and there are two kinds of climaxes we're going to get into here. They're the climactic moments, the small climaxes that come at the end of your chapters that keep your stakes and tension rising all the way up that plot arc to the big climax, the book's climax. So do either of you have a question or maybe something you've been thinking about with climaxes that'll kick off the discussion here?
Can you have a major one early in the story?
Well, no. No, if you do, that's your inciting incident, not a climactic moment. So Act 1, you open your book with your inciting incident, something that gets the ball rolling. At the end of Act 1, you've got that point of no return when your protagonist has to make a choice. Do I stay or do I go now? And we go. We launch the hero's journey through Act 2 with increasing stakes and tension, everything mounting and building to the big climax. So the sort of big thing at the beginning of the book would be your inciting incident.
So you can't have like a two-peaked mountain for your story structure?
Not really. I mean, it would be interesting to see someone pull that off. You don't want something at the beginning that tops the climax at the end. The climax at the end is like the payoff. You're rewarding your reader for sticking with you for 300 pages. So, you can do very exciting things at the beginning and they can be intriguing, but at the beginning of the book, we're never going to know the whole scenario, be fully invested in our protagonist, really worry about the stakes and tension. So the big inciting incident might be exciting and dramatic and compelling, but it's flash. It's for show because we aren't there yet with the characters. We aren't invested yet.
So I guess part of the climax is not so much, I mean, it is supposed to be like your biggest, boom, for lack of a better term, but it's more about almost like the investment in the character and the stakes that have been personalized for that character. So you might have something really crazy happen at the beginning, but your character's probably not as involved in it, and they're probably not as personally invested in it as it would be later in the...
Well, okay, yes and no, because let's break that down a little bit. So, yes, a huge factor in the climax is that at the end of the book, the reader has gone on the journey with your characters and really cares about how this turns out, who's better off, who's worse off, did we get the bad guy, all that kind of stuff. Now, at the beginning, let's take Star Wars, for example. The inciting incident is Luke comes home and the farm is burned and his aunt and uncle are dead. So he is personally invested in this, and this is a huge trauma and tragedy for him as a character. But the audience is not as invested in it because we don't really know Luke yet. Right. We haven't gone on the journey with him. So we're much more concerned about him and his fate and the fate of the world when he's got to blow up the Death Star than we are when he's just a teenager coming home with the androids and oops, I'm homeless,
Right.
So your protagonist could be completely invested and it could be a huge tragedy, but just know that your reader investment at the beginning of the book is a very different thing than at the end of the book.
Right. But even in that where Luke was all invested, he didn't have the agency and he wasn't doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like that tragedy happened to him and it was very personal, but like he himself wasn't a part of that happening.
Right.
So I mean, I don't know, really even know what I'm asking, but
Well, and that's why it's the inciting incident and not the climax, because in that
right.
moment when the farm is burned, he's not the hero yet. He's our protagonist, but he hasn't grown into the hero. He hasn't taken that journey yet, so he can't do anything about it. So this is the moment that launches his journey, because he's faced with a choice. What do I do now? Where do I go? How do I live my life? He's sort of unmoored from everything he's known in his world. Well, the only choice he can make in order to become that hero is to go back to Obi-Wan Kenobi and become the Jedi apprentice. But in real life, maybe he'd rebuild the farm or go join the army, or who knows, right? He has other choices. He chooses the one that launches the hero's journey. So that's the importance of that moment to our story, and one of the key ways it differs from the climax.
Right.
So I suppose you can have massive climactic moments in the story, but the climax of the story is closely tied to the ending payoff, and where everything has to come to a head, and it has to be driven by the main character's agency. Whereas at every other point in the story, climactic moments are merely that. They might be passive, they might be not everything coming to a head, they might just be there to drive the story forward. They could be even coincidental. The characters driving down the street and a bus smashes into them. It's a climactic moment, but it isn't, and it could be huge in the character's life, but it doesn't resolve the story.
Right. It doesn't resolve it, it progresses it. Yeah. So every chapter ends with some tension and intrigue that leads us into the next movement of the story. And some of those climactic moments will relate to the subplot, some to the main plot. So it depends on the action of the chapter we've just completed and what the protagonist is doing at that time. So if this has been a fairly quiet chapter dealing with relationships and one of the subplot issues, then the climax might be friction between characters, and the intrigue is, will this argument they've just had affect their ability to work together to advance the main plot? So that can be a kind of low stakes, low tension, climactic moment, but it still functions to move us forward and relates to the main plot.
Right.
And as we increase the conflict between our protagonist and antagonist, everything gets bigger, moving up toward that big climax.
So would it be fair to say that like a climactic moment is going to be like a turning point or a decision or something that your character does that then means that they can't go back to where they were at the beginning of the chapter?
Nope. Because as Robert was saying, it could be something that seems like a coincidence, like getting hit by a car or something like that then changes your life. So the climactic moment.
But that would be a turning point in the character's life, whether or not they directly created it, right?
Well, I mean, it depends on your story. I don't want to make such a specific statement like that because it depends on the book and what your characters are going through and how that relates to the main story. But your goal is to continually excite the reader enough to bridge that gap between chapters. Because when you finish a movement, and chapters are natural containers within a book, they hold those movements. You finish a movement, it's a natural place to put in a bookmark. It's like the TV episode ends, you take a week off, right? Then you come back to it, but we don't want our readers to take a week off or forever off. We want them to jump that gap and pick up the next chapter. So that climactic moment is a continual escalation. You don't want to get 2/3 of the way through the book and then drop your tension so low that the reader's like, that chapter was kind of boring. I'll just stop here and maybe never pick it up again. That's why we've got Freytag's pyramid and that arc of increasing escalation. So tension will go up and down somewhat, on the graph. But overall, if you zoom out, you want a nice rising line, a nice escalation.
Yeah, to use Kathryn's mountain analogy, you could be climbing Everest and going up peaks and troughs, but the ultimate peak is the one that completes the story. And depending on how severe and how tense your story is, that slope, of ascent might vary according to the level of drama you might be having with any particular climax.
Right.
But you're always ascending.
Yes. Because
otherwise you say, okay, well, the story's done. We're on the downhill run, So it's a useful analogy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Kathryn, you were saying, does every climactic moment turn the character back or create?
Right. Does it? Well, you kept saying that it moves the character forward, it moves the action forward. So I was wondering if a climactic moment is almost like a turning point where whatever has just happened, you can't go back to the way you were at the beginning of the chapter. You can't ignore it. You have to, either that's a decision point, or like you said, with a bus accident, something has happened to them that they then have to deal with,
right.
Or whatever that is.
Yeah, I'm still going to say no, because I think it's more subtle than that. So I think that's a really good sort of framework to say, generally speaking, am I always advancing my character in these ways? But when you get into the specific and nitty-gritty, sometimes the advancement, the intrigue comes from another character or another situation. So it can be that, now I need to address this thing. I can't go back. I have to make a new choice. And that's going to be very typical, especially in some genres more than others. But if you look at relationship-driven fiction, whether it's literary or contemporary or romance or whatever, it could be much more that the protagonist is in sort of a helpless place, and we turn the page because we want to see what happens next. So I'm thinking specifically of Anne of Green Gables, chapter 3, because this is one I use when I teach. Anne is left crying in bed at night, and the question is now, so Anne the orphan is brought home, and then she's rejected because she's not a boy. The Cuthberts really wanted a boy to help with the farm. So Marilla declares Anne has to go back to the orphanage. Anne goes to bed. She's crying herself to sleep. The chapter ends. So there's our climactic moment. Anne is heartbroken. Now what? Why do we turn the page? Why do we bridge that gap and keep reading? Well, Anne is just a little child. She's got no say in her fate at this point. So what is her action? Really, it's just to be herself, to be charming.
Yeah.
She has no specific action. But we bridge the gap because we're emotionally invested in her. And we know something is going to happen to turn her fate around. What is it? What's going to happen to change Marilla's heart?
So what part of that are you identifying as the climactic moment? Is her in tears, or is it when she's being declared that you are going back to the orphanage?
So this is a tricky chapter here to deal with, which makes it good to analyze, because it shows us how much variety there is and how we don't have to be so hard and fast about these rules. I have to have,
right,
this thing at the end. We know Marilla wants to send Anne back through most of the chapter. As soon as Anne is presented as a girl, Marilla's like, oh, this won't do. So I would say the climactic moment is Anne going to bed, because this is an emotional moment, and that's the moment that really gets the reader. It's this tableau of the little orphan girl who we've already come to adore in such short time, crying herself to sleep. It's just so sad and so tragic. So there, the climactic moment doesn't depend on action. It just depends on connecting with your reader's empathy and creating this mood and this image that gets you.
Interesting.
Well, I guess any climax, by definition, if we're saying it's a climax, then it's something reaching a peak. So I suppose you're looking at escalating tension, whether that's emotional tension in a underlying way of empathy with Anne here, and then the climactic moment is when it finally gets too much and it tips her over the edge. Both literally and metaphorically into crying.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that's really great. I'm glad you said that, Robert, because that's exactly what happens. Before Anne is put to bed, she's still plucky. She's still making her case for herself. And even when she knows she can't reverse her fortune and stay, she says, well, could you just call me by this other name? I just want a fancy, pretty name. And if you're only keeping me for a night, could you just call me this other name? So she's still being charming and witty and unusual. And, so when she starts crying and she's all alone in the dark, that's that breaking point where the tension crescendos. Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other thing that I know I've been guilty of, and in the past anyway, is repeating climaxes or making them too similar, so that the reader after a while gets bored. Oh, see, this is that gun scene again, know. And that's tricky, I think, as a writer, because you're trying to, whether it's a big bang crash or whether it's a subtle, emotional build. Either way, you're trying to build to this climax that you have in your head and this beautiful story ending, and along the way you're trying to introduce this tension and mini climactic moments, but you've got to make them all different, and you've got to do that over 100,000 words or whatever it is you're writing, and at the same time make all the characters believable and have them relate. And it's and no wonder some works of fiction you think, God, this has just never happened in real life. Well, no, of course it wouldn't. That's why it's a work of fiction.
Right.
Would all these things happen to any normal person over the space of 7 days? No, but
no, right.
It's interesting that you have to do that and do it in a way that is believable or suspends disbelief. It's no wonder it's hard.
It is hard, and that's a really good thing to mention, because as writers we do need to track what we do over the course of a book and ask ourselves, have I done this before? Have I done this in the best way possible at the best moment in my story possible? And then you need to revise to make sure you aren't being repetitive and that you are writing the most impactful scene that you can. So it's got to come at the right time with the right characters and the right stakes to keep your reader invested, because otherwise it is boring. One of the books I really didn't enjoy was it was a modern version of The Island of Dr. Moreau. So these people find this island in the sea off of Japan. They're shipwrecked there, and it's full of chimeras. So you've got, all sorts of ginormous man-eating, 6 different genetically modified creatures in one body, all of them deadly. And every chapter was just scene after scene of running around, getting wounded, trying not to be eaten. How do I kill this monster? What kind of stinger or fangs or claws does it have? And it was that, like, what's the point?
Yeah.
I've seen that one before.
That's right. We've seen this scene before, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is where, and then in our other episode on tropes, that brings to mind, the downside of tropes is repeating the same trope over and over. It's you need a deft hand to it, don't you? Because that's like the trope. Here's the recurring motif. It's the monster with the claws, and each time we've got to work out how to kill this particular one. But after a while, it's too overly. It's melodramatic.
Well, it is melodramatic, but I would say that those aren't tropes, because the trope is the small symbolic thing that recalls something else, and these are just the plot villains, the
mechanics.
The mechanics of the plot, the monster onslaught of monsters. So
variety is the spice of fiction.
What is?
I said variety is the spice of fiction.
Well, there you go. That's the way to think of the climactic moments, isn't it? That's right.
Yeah.
How varied am I? Are they varied sufficiently that it keeps the reader's interest, and they don't just dismiss it as, oh, here we go, and here we go again. Here's another standoff, in the office.
Right. Well, and I'm wondering if that book had interspersed the physical climactic moments of, oh my goodness, we're fighting these monsters, with the more like relationship, like who, who's leading, and emotional tension, and maybe there's not medication, or like different kinds of climactic moments, then you could have built through. I mean, because you probably are going to need a few climactic moments where you're dealing with these monsters if you're ever going to reach a climax where you're getting off of the island, or whatever the ending climax is. But if you intersperse it with the emotional, or the other kinds of climactic moments, then your reader's like, okay, like building back up to, well, they're going to have to go back out eventually, rather than, well, and here they go again.
Right. Exactly. I mean, you can have as many sword fights or gunfights or vampire slayings or whatever as you want and need, and that's part of what your readers love about that type of story, but you do need to intersperse it with so much more, with the characters, with the other kinds of problems they face. So the subplots, the relationships, the legwork, the, learning skills. And then that escalation piece is so important. You can't have your hero in an epic battle at the beginning of Act 2, when the epic battle has to be the climax at the top of Act 3. So each battle has to get more fraught, more dramatic, more dangerous, more peril as we go.
Yeah, and the climactic moments can seem to be the same. I mean, you can mirror I think when it's done artfully is when you get a climactic moment early in the story, and then when you revisit it later on, the hero or someone has learned something, they're able to apply it. So it might be even the same type of scene, but all of a sudden they're applying it or doing something different. And that's what gives you joy in the story, is that you've been through this together before. And here we are again facing down the same climax, but with new ability or new learning, or as a different person, or knowing something about the antagonist's weakness. And even I'm thinking, in Princess Bride, where William Goldman has the Inigo Montoya and what's his name?
Which
hero?
One?
Wesley?
Wesley, yeah.
Wesley, thank you. Yes, I can remember the actor's name, which is very similar. But and they have this massive sword fight, which is so hilarious at the top of the cliffs, and it establishes Inigo Montoya as well as what his particular subplot is, and then at the end we get the massive sword fight where he finds the six-fingered swordsman, and they have that big sword fight again, and we know that he's really, really good swordsman, but he starts to lose. You go, oh no, he can't lose. But then he comes back. So it can even relate to climactic moments with your supporting characters too.
Right. Oh, definitely. And what you were saying about the learning new things, that's a huge part of the hero's journey, where you have a character who starts out as an apprentice. And so those first fights have to be at the apprentice level so he can be beaten but not killed, because then you end your story prematurely. But each time as the stakes go up, he's better prepared for it. And so we get those displays of new skills and see the training pay off. And then there's that aha moment that usually comes at the moment of greatest peril, right? like we finally used the force, or
use the force.
Yes. Yeah. And Kung Fu Panda, when he finally understands why the scroll is blank. Have you seen Kung Fu Panda?
Yes.
Okay. Watch Kung Fu Panda.
All right, I'm on it.
Yes, classic apprentice
I've heard
story.
It's good. I just have not seen it yet.
Very good.
And also climactic moments where the reader expects, oh, this is another one of those scenes, and they kind of rub their hands and look forward to it because they know that they're each sort of escalating a bit. And I'm thinking Indiana Jones here, where he gets into those fight scenes, and there's that famous one where he gets into the fight scene, and you know he's going to whip that whip out and cut the guy's arm off or something, and he just pulls the gun out and says, "Bat!"
Right.
Kills the guy with the gun.
Yes. Yeah.
And there are all sorts of myths about how that came about in the way the scene was acted out and shot, but nonetheless, as a viewer, you kind of appreciate that because your expectation is that here we go again, the hero's going to defeat the bad guy in a way that's compelling and interesting and shows his skill, and he does, but he just does it in a completely different way. So it's the same type of climax, but executed completely differently.
And that
subverting the expectation.
Right, it introduces the element of surprise, which is great when you can surprise your reader.
Yeah, and kind of gets him in more trouble as well. So it complicates things, and because here he goes, he's brandishing a gun. He's just shot this guy, and now he's got all these people chasing him.
Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts on climactic moments?
No, I've peaked.
Building to the climax.
How long have you been waiting for that one?
At the end of the podcast, of course.
Right, of course. Now we just need the denouement to wrap this up. Yeah, all right. Well, on that note, hey, I've got a quick announcement for you. I am finishing up my next course in the Storyworks Fiction Online School. It is called Structure of Story, and if you liked the discussion we just had on climactic moments and climaxes, that is a big part of this course, as is so much more. In Structure of Story, we cover the plot arc, the 3-act structure, endings, scenes, chapters, climaxes, including those climactic moments, the 4 types of movement in any story, and then we go back and go deeper into 3 critical story elements, and we finish up with a brief unit on writing strong. It's going to be ready for enrollment very soon, but you don't even have to wait for that. You can go to storyworksfiction.com and enroll in the school, and then you will be the first to hear when Structure of Story is ready for you. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable and have a great writing week. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.